The barn was alive with fiddles, stomping boots, and laughter that rattled the rafters. Kennedy Price stood near the wall, her palms damp as she clutched a paper cup of punch she hadn't touched. She'd promised herself she would be different this year, less cautious, less closed off. But here she was again, half hidden in the shadows, watching everyone else live freely. Then he appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a man who didn't need to announce his presence. His eyes found hers across the room, and Kennedy swore her heart forgot how to beat. He walked toward her with unhurried strides, like he had all the time in the world. When he stopped in front of her, his voice was low, velvet smooth. "Looks like you're hiding." Kennedy blinked. "I'm not hiding." He tilted his head, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. "Then what would you call standing in the shadows with a full cup of punch you haven't touched?" Her lips curved, despite herself. "Maybe I just like to watch people, or maybe you don't like parties." She huffed a laugh. "You say that like you know me." He leaned a little closer, his voice dipping. "Maybe I'd like to." Her stomach flipped. The boldness in his tone was disarming but not unwelcome. Something about him felt safe, solid, like he carried warmth that had nothing to do with the heat of the crowded barn. "What about you?" she asked, tilting her chin toward him. "You don't strike me as someone who hangs by the walls." "I don't." He shrugged, easy and confident. "But tonight I figured the view was better over here." Her cheeks warmed. She tried to look away, but he was already watching her so intently she couldn't. The din of the crowd seemed to fade, and in its place was the quiet pulse of awareness, steady and certain. Just as she was about to ask his name, the band shifted. The fiddle softened, the beat slowed, and a sensual bluesy tune spilled through the barn, sultry and rich, curling like smoke in the air. His eyes glinted. He extended his hand, palm steady, dark skin glowing under the lantern light. "Dance with me." Kennedy's throat went dry. I don't really." "One dance," he murmured, coaxing. "That's all." Something in her chest cracked open. She'd promised herself to be daring, bold, alive. With a shaky breath, she placed her hand in his. He led her onto the dance floor, his hand warm and steady against hers. At first, their movements were tentative, Kennedy swaying lightly, him keeping a respectful distance. She felt the familiar nerves creeping in, the part of her that always wanted to hold back, to stay hidden. But then the rhythm of the song shifted, low and sultry, a black country blues that seeped under her skin like honey. Kennedy drew in a breath and remembered the promise she'd made to herself tonight, to be bold, to live, to stop hiding behind caution. So she let go. Her hips began to roll with the rhythm, fluid and natural, and she felt him stiffen slightly behind her, surprised maybe, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he matched her step by step, as though he had been waiting for her to take the lead. She turned, sliding her back against his chest, letting her waist move in time with the slow burn of the music. His breath hitched near her ear, and his hands tightened just a fraction at her hips, anchoring her without claiming her. The heat between them grew with every sway, every brush of her curves against his strength. The barn and its crowd faded, leaving only the two of them moving in sync, bodies alive with an unspoken rhythm. By the time the music drew to a close, Kennedy spun back to face him, breathless and trembling, their lips hovering a whisper apart. Their eyes locked, and the silence between them roared louder than any fiddle or guitar. The tension was thick, animalistic, demanding release. Kennedy swallowed hard, then made the daring move she'd been holding inside. Slowly, she reached up, cupped his face with both hands, and kissed him. His response was instant, his lips firm and hot against hers, but she could feel it, the restraint, the way he held himself back even as desire surged between them. And just then, as if the universe itself had conspired against restraint, the lights went out. Welcome to Porchlight Stories. If this tale has your heart racing and your breath catching, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a moment that keeps you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to turn on notifications. The next Porchlight story might just take you someplace even wilder. Our Porchlight family is growing fast, and we want to hear from you. Where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments below and join the conversation. Now, take a deep breath, because the story is only about to get more intense. The blackout swallowed the barn whole. Gasps and nervous laughter rose from the crowd, boots scuffling against the wooden floor as people fumbled in the dark. But Kennedy didn't move, because he hadn't moved. Even in the pitch black, his presence wrapped around her like heat from a fire, steady and grounding. She could feel his breath, feathering against her lips, could sense his gaze fixed on her as if the world hadn't just disappeared into shadow. "Don't look away," he murmured, his voice low and strained. 2 fingers brushed her cheek, coaxing her to tilt her face back toward him. His touch was gentle, but his eyes, though unseen, pulled at her like gravity itself. Then his mouth claimed hers. The kiss was deeper now, raw and consuming. His lips moved with an urgency that made her pulse skitter, a hunger she hadn't known she craved until this moment. Kennedy melted into him, her hand sliding to the back of his neck, her body arching closer until she could feel the strength coiled beneath his shirt. When his arms wrapped around her, lifting her effortlessly, instinct took over. Her legs wound around his waist, her skirt riding high as he held her up as though she weighed nothing at all. The crowd was still murmuring, but no one saw them, no one cared. For her, there was only him. His voice brushed against her ear, rough and trembling. "Tell me no, and I'll stop." Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her heart slamming against her ribs. But when she met the raw need in his voice, something deep inside her unfurled. "Yes," she whispered, the word shaky but certain. "Yes." The moment shattered what restraint he had left. He carried her swiftly through the barn's shadows, his grip strong and sure, until they slipped into the quiet of an empty lounge off the side hall. The air here was cooler, quieter, filled only with the sound of their ragged breathing. He pressed her gently against the wall, his forehead resting on hers for a fleeting heartbeat of hesitation. His eyes searched hers in the dim glow of moonlight slipping through a small window. And then he kissed her again, slow at first, tender, exploratory, reverent. She shivered at the way his lips traced hers, learning every curve, every sigh. It was as if he wanted to memorize her, to know her without words. But tenderness gave way to fire. His hands mapped her body with aching need, tracing from her hips up her waist, gripping her tighter with every passing second. She tugged him closer, her fingers digging into his shoulders, urging him on. When he finally gave in, when the hunger broke loose, Kennedy lost herself in the storm of it. His strength, his heat, the wild urgency that left her weak and breathless. They tumbled to the love seat next, laughter and gasps tangling together as he settled her beneath him. This time there was no hesitation, no careful testing, only urgency, sharp and electric, a reckless giving in. His mouth claimed her throat, her collarbone, her lips again, over and over, until she was dizzy from it all. The press of his body against hers, the grip of his hands on her thighs and wrists left no question of the power between them. But then, slower, different. Later, when they collapsed onto the carpet rug, the frenzy softened. He moved with unhurried devotion now, as though each touch carried a vow. His lips brushed her temple, her cheek, the curve of her jaw. His hands, once urgent, now lingered, caressing instead of claiming. Their breaths tangled in the stillness, the world beyond the walls forgotten. She looked into his eyes and found something that went beyond desire, something that terrified and comforted her all at once. It wasn't just need anymore. It was connection, soul-deep, undeniable. When at last they stilled, the silence was thick, filled only by the sound of their hearts beating against each other. Kennedy lay against his chest, her body trembling from more than exhaustion. She had come to the dance promising herself to be daring. She hadn't expected this, and as he pressed one last kiss into her hair, holding her like she was something precious, she knew, without knowing his name, that this night would change everything. The faint gray of dawn slipped through the narrow window, casting soft light across the room. Kennedy stirred, the warmth of tangled blankets and the ache in her body reminding her of everything that had happened the night before. Her hand brushed the space beside her, empty, cool, her eyes fluttered open. He was gone. For a moment, she lay still, her breath caught in her chest. Fragments of the night washed over her in waves, The dance, the blackout, the press of his lips against hers, the way his touch had shifted from careful to consuming to soul deep. She pressed her palm against her own lips, still swollen from his kisses, and felt the weight of it settle in her chest. She had never done anything like this before. Not Kennedy, the woman who played it safe, who kept her heart behind walls and her body behind armor. Yet with him, she had let everything fall away. And now, he was gone. She rose slowly, her legs shaky as she reached for her dress, crumpled on the floor. Pulling it on, she searched the room, half expecting to find a note, a name, something. But there was nothing. Kennedy paused in the doorway, her hand brushing the frame as she looked back one last time at the empty love seat, the tangled rug, the shadows that still whispered of last night's heat. Her chest tightened. Had she imagined the way he held her, kissed her, looked at her like she was more than just a stranger in the dark? Or had it been real? The sound of voices rose from the barn, laughter already returning as people recounted the blackout with amusement. Kennedy slipped quietly into the crowd, her head down, her heart pounding with the weight of a night that belonged only to her and the memory of a man whose name she didn't even know. But as she stepped into the bright morning air, one truth clung to her like a secret she wasn't ready to face. Whatever had happened in that room, it wasn't over. The days after the town dance felt both endless and heavy. Kennedy threw herself into the rhythm of ranch life, as if hauling water buckets and mucking stalls could scrub away the memory of that night. Her muscles ached from the extra effort, but her mind refused to quiet. No matter how many times she tried to bury it, flashes of the dance, the heat of his hands on her waist, the way his mouth claimed hers in the dark, kept breaking through like wildfire sparks she couldn't stamp out. She told herself it was a momentary lapse, a foolish whim brought on by the music and the shadows. But the memory clung stubbornly, refusing to dissolve into something simple or harmless. One morning, Kennedy was in the barn brushing down her favorite mare, Dolly, when her younger brother Marcus wandered in, chewing on a piece of hay like he thought himself a real cowboy. "You've been working overtime lately," he remarked, leaning against the stall. "Trying to impress someone?" Kennedy shot him a glare sharp enough to send him retreating a step. "Don't start with me today. I just have a lot on my plate." Marcus smirked, but didn't push. He was smart enough to know when her temper wasn't to be tested. Still, her own reaction startled her. She wasn't normally this short-tempered. Later that afternoon, Kennedy ran into town for supplies. The general store smelled of sawdust and spices, its shelves lined with everything from nails to jars of pickled okra. As she stood in line, she couldn't help overhearing a pair of ranch wives gossiping behind her. "Word is, one of the Holt boys slipped out of the barn early that night," one whispered, her voice thick with speculation. "No one knows where he went." Kennedy's chest tightened. Her hand faltered on the counter as she counted out change. The Holts again. That name seemed to circle her like a hawk these days. She told herself it was coincidence, yet unease prickled beneath her skin. Back at the ranch, Kennedy shrugged off her jacket and tossed it across her bed. Something heavy thudded against the quilt. Frowning, she picked up the jacket again, sliding her hand into the back pocket. Her breath caught. A cufflink. Silver, finely made, glinting in the fading light. She turned it over in her palm, her pulse quickening. She hadn't seen it before, hadn't owned anything like it, and yet, somehow, it was there, tucked neatly into her jacket pocket, as if waiting for her to find. Kennedy's heart thudded wildly. She closed her fist around the cufflink, her stomach swirling with questions she wasn't ready to answer. For the first time since that night, the memory didn't just haunt her, it terrified her. The cufflink weighed on Kennedy's mind for days. She kept it tucked in the top drawer of her nightstand, hidden beneath a stack of old notebooks, but every time she opened the drawer for something else, the glint of silver seemed to stare back at her like an accusation. It was proof. Proof that her mystery man hadn't been some dream conjured by the shadows in her own lonely heart. Proof that he existed, and that he'd left a piece of himself behind. But who was he? Kennedy tried to push the question aside as she drove into town the next week for supplies. The streets were busier than usual, wagons rattling, children darting between storefronts, women in sundresses gossiping under the shade of the old oak near the courthouse. She told herself to keep her head down, focus on the errands, but whispers found her anyway. They say the Holts are expanding again. More land, more money, more trouble. And didn't one of those boys slip out during the dance blackout? Folks been wondering about that. Kennedy tightened her grip on the feed sack she carried, her jaw clenched. Why did it always circle back to the Holts? At the diner that evening, her best friend Jasmine leaned across the table, eyes narrowed in that way she had when she smelled a secret. "You've been off," Jasmine said, stirring her tea with deliberate slowness, distracted. "What's going on, Kennedy?" Kennedy froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. She wanted to say everything. About the dance, the heat of his hands, the kiss that still burned her lips, the cufflink that now lived like a secret heartbeat in her drawer. Instead, she forced a laugh that sounded brittle even to her own ears. "Nothing," she said. "Just tired." Jasmine didn't buy it. She never did. That night, lying in bed, Kennedy stared at the ceiling while the ranch lay quiet around her. Crickets chirped in the grass, the old windmill creaked with every turn of the breeze, and still her mind wouldn't rest. At last, she rose, padded across the room, and pulled the cufflink from the drawer. She turned it over in her fingers, watching the silver catch the moonlight. On the underside, almost too small to see, were etched initials. G.H. Kennedy's breath hitched. She knew those initials. Everyone in town did. Graham Holt. The most eligible rancher in the county. The man whose family name had been at war with hers for years. The one man she could never, should never, have anything to do with. And yet, as her hand trembled around the cufflink, she knew the truth she had been trying to outrun. It had already happened. Kennedy hadn't meant to run into him. Truth be told, she'd been avoiding the thought of it altogether. But fate had its own plans. It was Saturday morning, and the town square buzzed with life. Farmers hawked melons and sweet corn from wagons, children tugged their mothers toward the bakery for cinnamon rolls, and a fiddler played under the shade of the old courthouse steps. Kennedy only meant to buy seed and slip away, but when she rounded the corner of the mercantile, her steps faltered. Graham Holt stood just ahead. Even in the bustle of the market he commanded attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, with skin bronzed from long days under the sun, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He looked nothing like the boy from her memories of Old Town feuds. He looked harder now, sharper, a man shaped by responsibility, not reckless pride. And on his right cuff, gleaming in the light, was the twin to the one in her drawer. Kennedy's stomach flipped. For one wild moment, she considered marching right up to him and returning the evidence. But her throat closed, her legs froze, and all she could do was watch as he spoke to the vendor, his voice a low rumble that reached her even through the clamor of the market. "Morning, Graham," a woman called, her tone coy. "You'll be at the town hall meeting next week, won't you?" He gave her a polite nod, his smile courteous but distant. "Wouldn't miss it." Kennedy ducked her head, turning sharply toward the alley that led to the feed store. Her heart hammered as if she'd narrowly escaped a stampede. She pressed a hand against her chest, trying to steady her breath. But as she stepped into the shadowed alley, she felt eyes on her. She turned. For a fleeting second, Graham Holt's gaze locked with hers across the crowd, his expression unreadable, intense. The air between them seemed to still, stretching taut like a rope about to snap. And then, just as quickly, he looked away, shaking the vendor's hand and moving on, as though she were nothing more than a passing face in the crowd. Kennedy swallowed hard, but in her bones she knew he had recognized her. The morning began like any other. Kennedy rose before dawn, pulled on her boots, and stepped into the crisp chill of early autumn. Mist clung low over the pastures, and the smell of dew-soaked hay filled her lungs. She loved these quiet hours, when the world was still waking and the ranch seemed hers alone. But today, something was off. Her mare, Dolly, whinnied anxiously from the far paddock, pacing near the fence line. Kennedy frowned, quickening her stride. As she drew closer, her gut twisted. The fence had been cut. Not fallen, not broken, cut clean through, the wood splintered where a sharp tool had done the job. She dropped to her knees, fingers tracing the edges. Whoever had done this hadn't been clumsy. They'd been deliberate. Heart thundering, Kennedy rose and scanned the pasture. Tracks marred the soft earth near the gate, boot prints, large ones, too large to be hers or Marcus's. Panic prickled beneath her skin. If Dolly had panicked enough to run, she could have wandered straight toward the highway. "Easy, girl," Kennedy murmured, climbing into the paddock. Dolly sidestepped nervously, nostrils flaring. It took nearly half an hour to calm her enough to lead her back into the barn, Kennedy's hands shaking as she latched the stall door. When Marcus stumbled into the kitchen later, hair mussed from sleep, Kennedy slammed the coffee pot onto the counter harder than she meant to. "The fence was cut," she snapped. "Not broken. Cut." Marcus blinked, still groggy. "Maybe it was just where—" "No." Her voice trembled with fury. "Don't you dare downplay this. Someone walked onto our land and tried to spook the horses." His expression sobered then, the boyish grin slipping away. He scratched the back of his neck. "You think it's connected to—" He didn't finish the thought, but Kennedy knew what he meant. The Holts, the feud that never seemed to die, passed down like a bad inheritance neither family had asked for. "I don't know," Kennedy admitted, her throat tight. "But I won't let anyone run me off my land." Later, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the fields, Kennedy walked the fence line again. Her hand brushed the fresh repairs, the wood smelling sharp from the saw. She forced herself to breathe deep, to stay calm. But just before she turned back toward the house, a flicker of movement caught her eye near the tree line, a figure, tall, watching, and then, just as quickly, gone. Kennedy stood frozen, the evening air sharp against her skin. A chill spread through her chest, sinking into her bones. Someone had been there, and they wanted her to know it. By the next morning, Kennedy told herself she was imagining things. Sleep deprivation, stress, the weight of endless chores, it all added up. She couldn't let fear run her off her own land, but her body betrayed her. While hauling a sack of feed across the barn, her vision swam. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her boots, and a sudden wave of dizziness stole her breath. She staggered, the feed sack slipping from her arms with a thud. "Kennedy?" Marcus's voice rang from across the barn. He rushed over, catching her elbow before she crumpled. "You all right?" She forced a shaky laugh. "Fine. Just didn't eat enough breakfast, I guess." But Marcus didn't look convinced. His eyes narrowed as he studied her pale face. "You've been pushing too hard. Between chores, trips to town, and whatever's eating at you, you're burning the candle at both ends." Kennedy waved him off, though her heart still raced. She wanted to believe it was just exhaustion, but a seed of unease had already taken root. That afternoon, she drove into town for a delivery at the diner. Jasmine was working the counter, her honey-brown eyes quick to notice every detail. "Girl, you look like you've been run over by a cattle drive," Jasmine said, hands on her hips. Kennedy rolled her eyes, though heat flushed her cheeks. "Thanks for the compliment." Jasmine leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Don't joke. You're pale, you're tired, and your body's trying to tell you something. You need to see a doctor." Kennedy brushed the concern aside with practiced ease, but her stomach twisted, because deep down she already suspected. On the drive home, the memory of Graham's hands on her waist, the heat of his breath against her neck, came flooding back with cruel clarity. The cufflink in her drawer suddenly felt heavier than ever, and when she pulled up to the ranch, the unease only deepened. The fence she had repaired yesterday cut again, this time in 2 places. Someone wasn't just testing her anymore, they were escalating. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner. Kennedy sat stiff in the plastic chair, her fingers knotted together in her lap. The clock on the wall ticked too loud, every second stretching until it felt unbearable. When the nurse finally called her name, Kennedy's legs felt like lead as she followed down the hallway. A few tests, a few polite questions, and then the doctor's kind eyes softened with a certainty that stole Kennedy's breath. "Congratulations, Miss Price," he said gently. "You're expecting." The words hit her like a thunderclap. She gripped the edge of the exam table, her knuckles white. She'd suspected deep down, but hearing it aloud made it real, terrifyingly, undeniably real. As she walked out of the clinic an hour later, clutching a folded pamphlet she wasn't ready to read, Kennedy's world felt unsteady. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel all the way back to the ranch. But if she thought the news would be her biggest shock of the day, she was wrong. The ranch yard was eerily quiet when she pulled up. Dolly whinnied nervously in the barn, her hooves striking the stall door. Kennedy's boots crunched over gravel as she rounded the corner and stopped cold. Her vegetable garden, the one she'd spent all spring planting, was destroyed. Rows of beans ripped from the soil, tomato stakes snapped, fresh earth trampled into chaos. Not by animals, by boots, deliberate, cruel. Kennedy dropped to her knees in the dirt, her breath shuddering out of her. The baby growing inside her, the future she hadn't even begun to process, and now this. Someone wanted her broken, piece by piece, until she had nothing left to stand on. Behind her, a twig snapped. Kennedy whirled, heart hammering, eyes scanning the tree line. But there was no one there, just the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Still, she couldn't shake the certainty that someone had been watching, waiting. The garden lay in shambles. Rows of once healthy vegetables had been trampled, their leaves crushed into the mud. Wooden stakes had been yanked from the ground, the irrigation hose slashed in two as though someone had taken a knife to her efforts. Kennedy stood frozen, a hand over her mouth, the taste of earth and dread heavy on her tongue. Marcus swore under his breath, moving through the wreckage with long strides. This wasn't an accident. Someone did this. His jaw was tight, his fists balled at his sides. Kennedy didn't answer. Her knees felt weak, her stomach twisting, not only from the sight of her ruined garden, but from the quiet, insistent truth she could no longer ignore. The dizziness, the morning sickness, the late cycle she had dismissed as stress. She'd gone to town for seeds and fertilizer, but instead she'd left with something else tucked in her jacket, pocket, a sealed envelope from the clinic. Now, staring at the destroyed garden, it felt like some cruel metaphor for her own life. Everything she had been carefully tending, her independence, her plans, her control, was suddenly overturned, uprooted by forces she couldn't manage. She slipped a hand against her flat stomach, her breath uneven. A baby. Her baby. The word was fragile, terrifying, impossible. Fear was the first emotion that clawed through her chest. Fear of being judged. Fear of the whispers that would circle through the small town. Fear of what it would mean for her future. She wasn't even sure if she had the strength to be a mother. Alone, with the ranch hanging by a thread and the sabotage worsening by the day. And then there was Graham. Her gaze drifted toward the barn. The faintest trace of cologne still lingered there, warm cedar and spice, the scent that had clung to his shirt the night he'd held her close. On the workbench, tucked between a stack of ropes and a chipped tin box, sat the cufflink she had found weeks ago, a Holt heirloom, unmistakable. Her chest tightened. The memory of his shy smile, the heat of his touch, the way their bodies had moved like a storm against the music, it all came flooding back. The memory burned bright, but it was tangled with something darker. He was a Holt, a man tied to the very family that had once threatened her land. Would he even want this child? Would he reject her? Would he turn his back like so many others had? Tears stung her eyes, unbidden. She crouched in the dirt, the smell of crushed tomato vines heavy in her nose, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. The pamphlet from the clinic crinkled in her pocket, a quiet reminder of the decision she couldn't escape. For a brief, fragile moment, joy flickered. The thought of a new life, of a tiny heartbeat, stirred something soft inside her. But it was fleeting, swallowed quickly by the weight of uncertainty. She wasn't ready. She wasn't sure she ever would be. Behind her, Marcus's voice broke through the haze. "Kennedy, we'll fix this. Whoever did it, they won't win. You're not alone in this." She nodded, but before she could reply, Marcus's voice dropped lower, sharper. "But you need to be careful who you let close. Holts don't forgive or forget. And Graham Holt showing up in town right when this starts, you don't find that suspicious?" Kennedy's head snapped toward him, her lips parting to protest. but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to defend Graham. She wanted to believe he had nothing to do with this, but doubt whispered through her, winding around her ribs like a snake. Marcus continued, his eyes hard. "I'm telling you, Kenny, I've seen his type. Smooth talk, easy smiles, but everything they do is for their family's gain. What better way to get under your skin than this?" He gestured toward the ruined garden. "Or worse, what if he's distracting you while his people tighten the noose?" Her stomach churned. She pressed her hand harder against it, as though shielding the secret she hadn't yet spoken aloud. A baby. Graham's baby. Her throat thickened. She wouldn't believe he was capable of sabotage, and yet the timing was damning. The garden destroyed, her world upended, his family's shadow stretching long across her land. As night fell and the ranch lights glowed against the dark horizon, Kennedy stood by the ruined garden, her hand pressed protectively against her stomach. She whispered into the wind, as if the earth itself might give her an answer. "Am I strong enough for this?" The silence that followed offered no comfort. Only the faint scent of cedar and spice drifting from the barn, like a ghost of the man whose presence both haunted and consumed her thoughts. Kennedy balanced the wooden crate against her hip, muttering under her breath as the weight shifted. It had been a long day, patching what she could of the ruined garden, fielding Marcus's warnings, and carrying the heavy secret pressing low in her stomach. The orchard's shade should have offered some peace, but even here, tension clung to her like a second skin. The bottom of the crate buckled suddenly, one slat giving way with a sharp crack. Dozens of apples tumbled out, scattering across the dirt in a rolling tide of red and gold. Kennedy cursed softly, dropping to her knees to catch what she could. A hand reached into her line of sight, steady and sure, plucking up an apple before it could roll into the weeds. "Need a hand?" Her breath caught. She looked up, and there he was. Graham. Sunlight haloed his frame, his dark curls damp with sweat, his shirt sticking slightly to his chest from whatever work he'd left behind. His expression was soft, almost careful, as though approaching a skittish colt. Kennedy's words tangled. She shook her head, looking back down at the apples, forcing composure. "I've got it." "Doesn't look like it," he said gently, crouching beside her. He moved without presumption, scooping up fruit and dropping it back into the crate, the silence between them thick but not unfriendly. For a while, only the sound of apples thudding against wood filled the space. But when their hands brushed, both reaching for the same one, Kennedy felt the air shift. Her pulse fluttered, heat pooling low in her chest. She drew back quickly, cradling the apple against her palm. "You don't have to keep doing this," she murmured. "Maybe I want to," Graham replied quietly. His gaze lingered, not demanding, just steady. "Kennedy, I know about our family history. I'm not your enemy, no matter what history says." The words carved through her walls, leaving her raw. She set the apple back in the crate with more force than necessary, pushing to her feet. "History matters, Graham. What your family did to mine, it doesn't just vanish because you say you're different." His jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to her temper. Instead, he stood slowly, brushing dust from his hands. "Maybe it doesn't vanish, but maybe we don't have to keep living inside it either." Her throat closed. She wanted to argue, to shove him away with words as sharp as Marcus's warnings. But when she met his eyes, those deep, earnest eyes, she felt something break inside her, something small but undeniable. That evening, the ache of the day followed her into the house. She built a fire in the stone hearth, the flickering glow casting long shadows on the walls. She sat on the rug, her knees pulled to her chest, staring into the flames as if they could burn away her doubts. But instead of clarity, images of Graham filled the firelight. The brush of his hand against hers, the softness in his voice when he said he wasn't her enemy, the way his presence made her feel both unmoored and steadied at once. Her hand drifted unconsciously to her stomach. The secret there pulsed like an ember, unspoken, terrifying, but alive. And as the firelight danced, she whispered to herself, a prayer she wasn't sure was for strength or forgiveness. "Don't let me fall for him." The flames crackled in answer, their light warm against her skin, and for the first time Kennedy feared it was already too late. The letter was small, folded neatly in an unmarked envelope. Kennedy read it once, twice, then a third time, the words searing into her chest like a brand. I know. Her hands trembled as she held the slip of paper over the flames. The edges curled, blackened, then crumbled to ash, the letters disappearing into smoke. She hugged her arms tight around herself, shivering despite the warmth of the fire. Whoever had written it knew something, too much. And though she'd fought it for weeks, she couldn't shake the gnawing thought that Graham was her mystery man, the man whose cologne still haunted her dreams, the man whose eyes burned with recognition when they met hers across a crowded room. A storm rolled in that night, sudden and violent. Rain slashed against the windows, wind howling through the eaves until the lights flickered once, then went out. Darkness swallowed the house whole, leaving only the dull glow of dying embers in the hearth. Kennedy grabbed a shawl and stepped onto the porch, cursing softly under her breath. The storm had drowned the night in gray sheets of rain, so heavy she almost missed the figure at her gate. He stood there, water running down his face and dark curls plastered to his forehead. Graham. Her breath caught. Graham? Her voice was barely audible over the storm. He pushed the gate open with one hand, his other steadying himself against the post. His chest rose and fell hard. Whether from the rain-soaked run or the weight of what he carried, she couldn't tell. I remember pieces, he said, his voice low, hoarse. Not enough. But one thing I know for sure. His eyes locked on hers, rain dripping from his lashes. It was you. Her stomach clenched. Lightning split the sky behind him, throwing his features into sharp relief, vulnerable and desperate all at once. You don't know what you're saying, Kennedy shot back, shaking her head. Fear twisted her insides. You can't just show up in the middle of a storm and what? His voice cracked, raw. Say the truth out loud? I may not remember everything from that night, Kennedy, but my body does. My soul does. It was you. Her lips trembled, words tangling in her throat. She wanted to deny him, to push him away, but her secret clawed its way out instead. I'm pregnant, she whispered, her arms wrapping protectively around herself. The storm seemed to go silent for a moment. Graham's eyes widened, his breath catching in his chest. Is it mine? His voice was a plea stripped bare. She shook her head fiercely, tears springing hot to her eyes. I won't tie you to me without certainty. I can't. I won't. I don't care, he said, stepping forward. Rain ran down his face, his voice straining under the weight of it. Whether it's mine or not, I'll take responsibility. I'll be there for you. The words were too much, too close. Kennedy's chest heaved, her heart torn between the safety of distance and the pull of him. With a choked sound, she turned on her heel and fled back inside, leaving him standing in the rain. By dawn, his truck tracks carved long scars into the mud of her drive. A neighbor's headlights cut through the mist, catching Graham just as he drove off. By breakfast, the gossip had already begun. The town wasted no time. By noon, whispers slithered through the diner, the feed store, even the pews of the little white church. Kennedy Price trapped Graham Holt. No, he took advantage of her. You know how those Holts are. Either way, it's a shame. Her daddy would have died all over again. Kennedy heard them all, even when no one dared say it to her face. She kept her chin high, her back straight, but inside, the walls were crumbling. Her world, already fragile, was closing in fast. That evening, another envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, no handwriting she recognized. She tore it open with shaking fingers. You think you can hide what you've done? Everyone will know soon enough. Her knees nearly buckled. She pressed the letter to her chest, bile rising in her throat. Whoever was behind this didn't just want to ruin her reputation. They wanted to destroy her. At sunset, Graham appeared again. His face was tight, his shoulders rigid, but his eyes carried something else, desperation. I don't care what they say, he told her, his voice rough but steady. I don't care about the rumors. I want you, Kennedy, not just the baby. You. Her heart lurched painfully. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to. But fear anchored her. She was already the girl whispered about in grocery aisles, the girl who might forever be known as the one who got pregnant in the dark. Tears welled hot as she shook her head. You don't know what you're asking. You don't know what it's like to live with a scar like this. His jaw clenched. Then let me carry it with you. Something in her broke. She almost reached for him, almost let herself fall. But before the words could leave her mouth, a wave of dizziness overtook her. The world spun violently. Kennedy. Her knees buckled, and everything went black. When she opened her eyes, she was in Graham's arms, rain-slick grass underfoot as he carried her toward his truck. Put me down, she rasped, weak but furious. Not a chance, Graham said, his voice hoarse with fear. You're going to the doctor, whether you want to or not. The sterile scent of the clinic hit Kennedy the moment she stirred awake on the narrow bed. She blinked, disoriented, until the doctor's kind face came into view. Miss Price, your baby is healthy, he said with calm certainty. Heartbeat strong, no complications. Relief trembled through her, brief, fleeting. But then his voice gentled, shifting. Based on the timing of conception, there's virtually no chance the father could be anyone except Graham Holt. The words crashed into her like a flood, stealing the air from her lungs. Kennedy turned her head slowly and found Graham there, seated beside her, his eyes glassy, his hand gripping the armrest as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded. Their gazes locked, and in that moment, there was no more denial, no more maybe. The truth bound them together, unshakable. But truth had a way of dragging shadows with it. Because as they left the clinic, another truth unfurled, one far darker. Sheriff Ames was waiting by her truck, holding a folder of evidence. Kennedy, he said grimly. We found proof the sabotage on your ranch came from inside Holt land. Her stomach plummeted. She looked at Graham, whose face had gone ashen. Inside Holt land. The truth about the baby had barely settled when another revelation rose like a storm. Someone in Graham's own household wanted to see her destroyed. The sheriff's words echoed in the damp evening air, heavier than the storm clouds still clinging to the horizon. Inside Holtland, Kennedy felt her chest tighten, a coldness creeping into her bones despite the lingering warmth of Graham's hand brushing against hers. What do you mean by that? Graham demanded, his voice rough with disbelief. Sheriff Ames opened the folder, pulling out photographs, grainy but clear enough. Grain scattered across the ground, fences clipped, hoofprints leading away from Kennedy's pasture and toward the boundary line of Holtland. Kennedy's stomach churned. This wasn't speculation. This was proof. I'm not saying Graham here had anything to do with it, Ames said carefully, his gaze flicking between them. But someone close to the Holt property wants you ruined, Kennedy, and they've gone to some trouble to make sure of it. Graham's jaw clenched hard. No one in my family would... He cut himself off, shaking his head like he could erase the thought before it settled. Kennedy caught the flicker in his eyes, the shadow of someone he didn't want to name. Her voice was quiet but sharp. Who? Graham looked at her, torn. His lips parted, closed again. It's not possible. Sheriff Ames snapped the folder shut. I'll let you two sort this out, but I suggest you do it fast, because whoever's behind this isn't just trying to ruin reputations. They're escalating, and it won't stop until we stop them. He tipped his hat, left them standing in the gravel lot, and drove off in a haze of red taillights. For a long moment, neither Kennedy nor Graham spoke. The silence pressed down, broken only by the chirr of cicadas rising from the fields. Finally, Kennedy whispered, You already know who it is, don't you? Graham raked a hand through his wet hair, his shoulders sagging under the weight of unspoken truth. His voice was low, almost broken. My brother. Kennedy's breath caught. Eli? The name twisted in her gut. Eli Holt, the younger brother who'd always carried a quiet bitterness in his eyes. She remembered the way he'd watched her once, his gaze sharp with something that wasn't just curiosity. Graham nodded, shame pulling his features taut. He's been struggling. The ranch passed to me after Dad's stroke. And Eli, he never forgave me for it. He thinks I've taken everything from him. The land, the legacy, maybe. His throat worked hard. Maybe even you. The words hit her like a slap. She shook her head fiercely. Graham, I've never... I know, he cut in, his voice harsh, almost pleading. I know you haven't. But Eli's never been rational when it comes to resentment. He blames me for everything. And if he's behind this, Graham's voice cracked, his fists curling tight, if he's the one who's been hurting you, trying to scare you... Kennedy felt the ground tilt beneath her. Fear and anger coiled together, hot in her veins. You need to confront him, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her, before he destroys both of us. That night, Graham drove Kennedy back to her ranch, but instead of leaving her at the gate, he killed the engine and sat in silence. The headlights illuminated the fence line, the same one that had been cut weeks before. Stay inside, he said finally, his jaw set. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me. Graham, I mean it, Kennedy, please. His eyes, when they met hers, were raw, unguarded. If Eli's desperate enough to sabotage your land, he might be desperate enough to do worse. I won't risk you, or the baby. Her hand trembled on the door handle. Part of her wanted to argue, to stand her ground, but the plea in his voice broke her. I'll wait, she whispered. Graham found his brother at the Holt barn, the lantern light flickering against the weathered wood. Eli was hunched over the workbench, his back stiff, his hands clenched. You've been busy, Graham said, his voice echoing like a gunshot in the quiet. Eli stiffened, but didn't turn around. You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough. Graham stepped closer, each word sharp with fury. The sabotage, the letters, trying to ruin Kennedy, that was you. Eli turned then, his face twisted with years of bitterness. His eyes burned with something darker than jealousy, something close to hatred. You took everything from me, Eli spat. The ranch, the name. Her, always her. Graham's stomach dropped. Her? Kennedy? You think... She should have been mine, Eli hissed, slamming a fist onto the bench. But you swooped in like you always do. And when I realized you'd already been with her... His mouth curled into something cruel. I couldn't stand it. You don't deserve her, Graham. You never did. Rage flared hot in Graham's chest, but beneath it was something else. Fear. Not for himself, but for Kennedy. For the fact that his brother's obsession had crossed a line. You're going to stop this, Graham said, his voice steel. Right now. Or I swear, I'll make sure the sheriff puts you so far behind bars you'll never see daylight again. Eli's laugh was hollow, chilling. You think you can save her from me, from this town? She's already marked, Graham, pregnant, alone. Do you really think anyone's going to see her as anything but damaged? Graham lunged forward, grabbing Eli by the shirt front, his knuckles white. Say another word about her, and I'll forget you're my brother. Eli's smirk faltered, but his eyes still burned with venom. For the first time, Graham realized something terrifying. Eli wasn't just jealous, he was dangerous, and Kennedy was right in his path. That night, Graham returned to Kennedy's ranch, his clothes dusted with hay and sweat, his jaw tight. She opened the door before he could knock, searching his face. What happened? She whispered. He brushed past her, shutting the door firmly behind him. His voice was quiet, deadly certain. It's worse than I thought. Eli won't stop, not until we make him. Kennedy's heart pounded as the storm outside rolled again. She knew, with bone-deep certainty, that the final reckoning was coming, and this time, the fire between them might not be enough to save them from the flames. The town gathered under a brilliant sky, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The charity barn dance was a year past, yet for Kennedy it felt like a lifetime. She rested one hand against the swell of her belly, the other tucked into Graham's as they walked into the hall together. The whispers hadn't stopped entirely. Some folks still glanced sideways, lips twitching with judgment. But more and more, the voices had softened. People had seen Graham stand beside her through the storm. They had seen him renounce Eli when the truth came out, that it was Eli behind the sabotage, the notes, the cruelty. When the sheriff finally arrested Eli for trespassing and destruction of property, it broke Graham. Kennedy remembered holding him that night as he wept quietly, the weight of family loyalty shattering against the need to protect her. She had whispered into his shoulder, "You chose right, you chose us." Now, weeks later, the dance floor was lit once again. No power outages this time, no darkness to hide in, just strings of lights overhead, glowing golden against the timber beams. "Do you regret it?" Graham asked suddenly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. His voice was low, uncertain, the way it had been in their earliest moments. "Any of it?" Kennedy turned to him, really turned, so he could see the truth in her eyes. "No," she whispered, "not even the hardest parts, because they brought me here, to you, to us." The band struck up a slow tune, a bluesy country waltz that stirred something deep in Kennedy's chest. Graham hesitated, then extended his hand with a shy half-smile. "Dance with me?" She laughed softly, remembering the first time, the storm in her veins, the fire in her body, the kiss that changed everything. She set her hand in his, letting him lead her out beneath the lights. They moved together slowly, his palms steady against the small of her back, her belly pressing lightly between them. This dance wasn't wild or desperate. It was something deeper, healing, grounded, the rhythm of two people who have committed to choosing each other every day. When the song ended, Graham lowered his forehead to hers, his voice a quiet vow. "No more running, no more shadows. I'm here, Kennedy, always." She smiled through the tears brimming in her eyes, her hand resting over his heart. "And I'm not afraid anymore." The crowd blurred around them, the music faded, and for one shining moment it was just them, the woman who'd once sworn she'd face it all alone, and the man who'd proven that love, even born in darkness, could lead them into the light. Outside, dawn broke over the fields, painting the land in gold. A new day, a new beginning. And in Kennedy's heart, for the first time in forever, she felt peace. Thank you for listening to The Baby at the Barn Dance. Stories like this remind us that love isn't always neat or easy. It's messy, complicated, and at times born in the darkest of moments. But if we're brave enough to face the pain, forgiveness, and the whispers of others, love can also be the most healing and powerful force in our lives. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Porchlight Stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Our Porchlight family is growing every day, and we'd love to know, what was your favorite part of this story? Was it during the first night, when they let the night carry them away, or him standing beside her always? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Till the next story, we'll keep the porch light on.